Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. A very happy new year to you, by the way. Now, I'm delighted that my guest this week has been called the most quoted sociologist in the UK. Frank Furedi is emeritus professor at the University of Kent in sociology. He's written numerous books, the themes of which have ranged from the risk aversion culture in our society today through to the cult of fear. Indeed, his most recent book is this, How Fear Works, the Culture of Fear in the 21st Century. I'm delighted he's with me now. Hello there, Frank.
Hi there.
Happy New Year to you too.
Happy New Year.
And can I start by asking something which, when I was reading through the book, came out, which was that you say that now fear is sort of something in our society which exists almost entirely alone. It's got, as you put it, a commanding moral position. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I think what's happened in the last 20 years is that as the basic kind of moral values and beliefs have lost their significance to people's lives, as ideologies unraveled, so increasingly in public life, people use fear as a way of making statements, as a way of legitimating their cause. So people tell us that unless we eat this particular vitamin, we're all going to be ill. We have to go vegan because eating meat is going to destroy the planet, but also will destroy our way of life. And virtually every cause, whether it's political or economic, is justified in terms of scaremongering. And that's something that transcends the ideological divide, because both the left and the right very often, instead of putting forward a message of hope, very often put forward a message of fear. And that's, in fact, the main reason why I wrote this book, because the thing that I was really concerned with was that as children were growing up, as we were socializing them, instead of telling them about good positive values like prudence or courage or loyalty or duty, we basically teach them psychological tricks about how to avoid dealing with your fears.
Such as how? How does this translate, for example, when it comes to our treatment of children?
For example, if you look at the way that children are educated, especially in schools but also by parents, we tell them that they need constant validations. We're not allowed to criticize them. Just a couple of days ago, for example, we were told on Radio 4 that we must stop isolating children in schools when they misbehave, because it will traumatize them. It'll be bad for their emotional health. And virtually every form of discipline that was used in the past now comes with a health warning. And therefore, instead of questioning or criticizing them, what we tend to do is we basically give them smiley faces. We tell them that they have to raise their self-esteem. We kind of create an environment where they never have to deal with the distresses and the problems of everyday life. And therefore, they become very one-sidedly nervous and anxious about engaging with uncertainty. And I think that's the reason why you have a young generations of people in their 20s who find it very difficult to deal with what I call existential problems, because these days what we call existential problems, which is the problems of everyday life, are increasingly seen as medical ones. Stress all of a sudden becomes a huge problem. When I was young, stress was a buzz, seen as being an essential ingredient for creating something, for making something happen. Now stress is seen as a marker for some kind of medical disease. If you and I go to a party these days and we're a little bit shy and we're looking at our shoelaces, we don't know how to mix, we're diagnosed as having social phobia. So every problem, personal problem that you and I can possibly have or imagine is now diagnosed by some kind of medical expert. And when we do that, then what we do is we shield ourselves from human experience, we shield ourselves from each other, and become less and less able to deal with the difficulties that will inevitably face us in our lives.
So we're basically pathologizing ordinary human experience?
We are. It's almost as if we think that we should be spared the burden of having to deal with challenges. And indeed, the way we use the word challenges these days is by trivializing it. So if you ever listen to some professional person or a public sector advocate, they talk about this is a very challenging experience. And what they really mean by is that it's a little bit difficult, right? So we don't speak in a plain English in the language of everyday life. We got these euphemisms that we use. I think one of the most troublesome feature of British public life are these use of euphemisms that avoid being clear. So we don't talk about problems, we say this is problematic, whatever that means.
Okay,
or if you misbehave, for example, I don't say, Peter, you were bad. I would say that was inappropriate.
Inappropriate.
I mean, I can give you a long list of these, weasel words that avoid, sort of being clear about what we're doing and saying.
You mentioned challenge there. To me, it seems that one has replaced problem. People say this is the main challenge we face. It's almost has to be put into a positive framework.
Exactly, because there was a time when I was young, when a challenge meant I don't know, walking up the Himalaya or something, or running the mile under 4 minutes. I mean, that's what a challenge. Whereas now a challenge is crossing the street on your own as a 12-year-old. A challenge is, sort of being able to tie your shoelaces at the age of 9. I mean, this is how we've kind of trivialized it.
We're talking about domestic and educational situations there. What do you think the overall effect of this cultural fear is on our whole psychology as a culture?
I think the most important dimension of our fear culture today is we tend to turn almost every what I would call a theological or a philosophical or a moral problem into a medical one, and we kind of sidestep having to deal with it. So gradually we're losing a language that makes it very, very clear about what is right and what is wrong. So for example, one of the biggest casualties of this kind of culture that I'm describing is the act of judgment. I mean, there used to be a time when in Christianity, in Judaism, in the Enlightenment secular philosophies, judgment was seen as a medium through which we make sense of the world. Through judgment, we come closer to each other because I judge you and you judge me, and through judging each other, we create a public world where we're having conversations and dialogues. These days, the virtue in our world is no longer judgment. That's seen as being really bad, and we have a new word for it called judgmentalism or judgy, which I love. That's a real
judgy. That's a new one.
That's a big American word. Oh, Dad, you're being so judgy, right? And what we have is a situation where the virtue is non-judgmentalism. So we teach children in schools that it's important to be non-judgmental. And very often you will find celebrities on television saying, we don't have to be judgmental. I'm non-judgmental, as if somehow that's a signature of saintlyhood. But actually, judging each other, being judgmental, is the essential element of human communication.
Of course.
If I don't judge you, then what I'm really saying is, Peter, I don't take you seriously. I don't particularly care what you think. That's what non-judging means. Judging means that I'm looking into you and making kind of conclusions about whether you're right or wrong or good or bad.
But it's also phony, isn't it? Because people are all the time making judgments.
Absolutely, but this is exactly the case, yes. Because I don't know anybody, who's genuinely non-judgmental. You got to be a complete airhead not to judge people. And in fact, we find that the same people who in one breath say, I'm non-judgmental, at the same time will call you a Brexiteer. Because you're a Brexiteer, you must be xenophobic. And because you're xenophobic, you must be a lower moral human being than I am. And you'll find that they're very, very kind of casual and promiscuous with judging people that they don't even know, just because they assume that if you vote on this particular issue in this way, that it must follow, that all these horrible associations will kick in.
Do you think this is something that is really a thing of the West? I mean, I don't see these trends necessarily in other parts of the world.
Well, there's a problem, and the problem is that America, for all its sins, for all its weaknesses, the fact that it's not keeping up with China, is nevertheless still the dominant the hegemonic power in terms of soft power. And I think that the influence of Netflix, the influence of MTV, the influence of popular culture, Hollywood, all these things percolate throughout the world. And I know, for example, I spent a lot of time in East Europe, and most East Europeans except for a very small minority of people, are not influenced by this kind of approach. But then you can sense that gradually, as young people hear these songs, where they hear that being judgmental is horrible, it's a sin, where they begin to watch Netflix, where everybody, sort of adopts this form of thought. Those things do begin to influence. And I noticed I was very recently in Asia, and even amongst the Asian middle class, you kind of get this kind of what I see as the imitating of this kind of behavior, because it's seen as the virtuous way of being. I mean, just imagine you watch the BAFTA Awards. Just imagine you watch the Oscars. What are you going to hear? All you're going to hear is people talking about those judgy people, or those people talking about, sort of people who are inappropriate, and it's very easy then to kind of internalize this kind of stuff.
The irony, of course, of that is that they are doing it at ceremonies which are built on the whole idea of saying this is the best and this is not.
Absolutely, yes.
You're actually from Hungary, aren't you?
Yeah.
You're from Budapest, and but you're saying you're seeing this seeping into the culture of Eastern, Central Europe.
I mean, the way I see it is that, is that amongst the younger generations, who are digitally savvy, who are always on the internet, who listen to the latest music, who watch the films, this influence inevitably has an impact, because even though they might see themselves as Hungarian, they're proud to be Hungarian or Polish or Czech, nevertheless there's this overwhelming influence that's quite global, and we feel that in England, in France, and everywhere else. I mean, if the French cannot resist it and they're continually complaining about the influence of American music, the East European societies who have far less economic resources to deal with these things, are less able to do it. And in fact, one of the things that I've been doing very recently is I've been doing some lectures around Europe, both in East and the West. And what I've been doing is talking to the younger generations, mainly kids between 16 and 19, because they're still idealistic at that point. They haven't become cynical, and they haven't been too conformist to this kind of new ethos, and trying to appeal to their natural risk-taking impulses, their desire for being idealistic, their desire to know what is right and what is wrong, and trying to encourage them to have the courage of their conviction rather than just simply to conform what is the dominant cultural ethos of our time.
And also, presumably, to help them understand that there are such things as good risks to take, as opposed to every risk being essentially fraught with danger.
Absolutely. I mean, I always remember my dad, at the age of 9, explaining to me that there are good risks and there are bad risks. And I grew up on that. And sometimes I heard about, we don't know, it might be good or it might be bad. Well, these days, to talk about a good risk is to court the accusation of being irresponsible. Because a risk is by definition irresponsible. It's got negative connotations to it. And I think that kind of sense of, it's a very kind of defensive, sense of not believing in your human potential.
Yes.
Is something that we need to be really worried about, because that kicks in at the economic level, the political, the cultural level all the time. And we've become these people who are almost closing in on ourselves. And instead of being open to new experiences, we kind of find 101 excuses as to why not now, why not me, and why not in this situation, which seems to be the main kind of ethos that is being taught in schools and in universities.
I did sociology, at least for A-level, and I remember reading a lot and being taught a lot about moral panics.
Yeah.
How is the kind of current cult of fear different to good old-fashioned moral panic?
Well, I've been arguing that moral panics only do occur, and there are many examples, but they only occur when there is a consensus about what is moral. Right. So I remember when I moved to England, there was a very clear understanding that this is good and this is bad, and there was no big debates about it. The question was whether you could live up to the good or not. And young people would know that these are the values that they had to live by. They might not like them, but they knew that sooner or later they would have to match up to them in some shape or form. Now, I think in our world today, there's a total absence of moral consensus. In other words, if you go down the street and ask people questions about what is right and what is wrong, what are the values that you live by, it's an alien language now. Because in our world, we don't teach children about what is good and what is bad. We teach them to have emotional skills. We teach them relations. It's all about skills, relationship skills. We teach them to negotiate. We use the kind of word negotiate, difficult problems. But we don't tell them that in our world this is virtuous and this is not. In fact, the word virtue doesn't exist anymore. So under those circumstances, when there's no moral consensus to panic about, which is what it presupposed that there was a certain moral consensus that had to be defended, that's why there was a panic. If that doesn't really exist, and if there are different moral spheres pretty much ghettoized in our society, then the panics that do occur or the overreactions that do occur have a distinctly non-moral character. And what's happened more and more is that what we used to call moral panics have become increasingly medicalized. They become medical problems. I mean, every time I open a newspaper, we hear about the stress in offices. People are not able to work because they've been harassed and they've been traumatized by it. And it's always a medical language we use rather than a moral language.
Where do you think the current, I would say it's a form of panic, fear over environmentalism, do you think, would you characterize that as being part of the cult of fear at the moment? This kind of sense of impending doom, how much time have we got?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a fundamental element in our culture of fear, which is that we're detached from the future. We regard the future as a alien, destructive territory, and it's very rare these days to read a novel or see a film where the future is portrayed in a positive way.
Almost never.
Well, exactly, almost never, in fact. And what you have instead is a very dystopic view of what the future is like. And I think what we've done with the environment is we projected our own personal and communal insecurities into the environment. We can naturalize them. And once you do that, and once the issues to do with the environment become pollution, global warming, which all of them are invisible in the first instance, because you cannot see global warming. Even when they try to show it on TV, they have to speed up the cameras. You cannot see pollution. You can see the effects of pollution. Once you have this invisible threat existing on a global scale, then it becomes an unbounded fear. There is no end to it. I mean, you can project any fantasy onto that, and that's why we find that you have people almost talking like religious nutters from the Middle Ages, talking about extinction next year or the year after, and really believing that. I mean, they really do believe, just like those young children that went on a children's crusade in the early Middle Ages, that unless you do something now, this is the end of the world.
Where does that leave us with Greta Sundberg? I think you recently described her as being symptomatic of a societal crisis, actually. I mean, is that what? Because we're listening to young people, what?
Well, I mean, I listen to everybody, but I think there's something very sad when the adult world hides behind children. And we kind of put the children in the front line and, in a sense, kind of cultivate it. It really does remind me of the old children's crusade when people hid behind 9-10-year-olds as a way of promoting their cause because they didn't have the courage of their own conviction. And so I think that's a problem. The other problem, of course, which is more fundamental in the long run, is that the adult world, particularly in the Anglo-American sphere, has given up on its authority.
Given up on its authority?
Yeah, it doesn't believe that it's right to give that direction to children. It no longer gives leadership or inspires them. And we are in the middle of a process that I call in my own other writings socialization in reverse, which basically means that we're getting the children to tell us how to behave rather than the other way around. So, when I was young, when you were young, presumably parents guided you and told you what is right and wrong, how to behave. Now parents look to their children very often. So you have English mums going into a shop, and it's their daughter tells them what to wear rather than the other way around. And I think that kind of socialization in reverse, the giving up of adult authority, is to me it represents a real cultural regression, where essentially you give up on your role as a responsible adult to take responsibility for the future generations.
Maybe even down some of that to the kind of cult of youth, i.e. that youth has inherent wisdom that once we used to attribute to older people by its very nature, age.
That's right, yeah. It's very, very interesting that the idea that old people have something to teach us is not seen as a joke, sort of. And I've written about how professionals, experts, tell parents not to allow the grandparents to tell the children how to behave, or allow children to spend too much time with the grandparents, because their child reading techniques is very outdated and is likely to make them sort of the worst. So in Finland they did this study which basically proved that children become obese when they spend too much time with their grandparents, because apparently grandmas just shove sweets down their throats.
I know mine did.
Yeah, well, so did mine, and I'm still here. So
Frank, a lot of your positions and a lot of the themes that you take up and explain to people, these would find favour. You mentioned earlier that these are not a left-right thing, but many of them would find favour on quite a traditional conservative side of an argument. But I wonder where you are politically now. I mean, you quite famously founded the Revolutionary Communist Party in the 1970s.
That's late 70s, yeah.
That's right. And I was at Kent in the early 80s, and the RCP was a real force, actually, on campus. I wonder, are you still a Marxist?
I find it very difficult to describe what I am. I can only tell you, if you give me a bit of time to kind of indicate how I've come to where I've been. Mm-hmm. I think that what has happened with me is that I had certain experiences in my life which had a profound effect on my outlook. One such experience was, it sounds very trivial, but it was the late 70s, even when the RCP was in existence. I remember students at the university and elsewhere adopted this policy of no platform. And I remember saying to myself, well, if we believe in democracy, if we have confidence in our arguments, why do you want to deny the National Front or any other organization the right to argue and debate with you? And I actually wrote a little pamphlet on that, and I got into a lot of trouble because everybody on the left was saying that Furedi is appeasing the fascists by being prepared to argue with them. And at that point I realized that, whatever I wasn't like them. I wasn't like the left was. The second experience I had, which completely shook me up, had a really big impact on me, was when, I don't know if you recall, in the 80s, you had these major trials occurring about child abuse up north. And many of them were entirely based upon false accusations. And I remember talking to somebody who was actually quite close to me on the left. And he was saying, Frankie, what you don't realize is that in England, 1 out of 4 working class men is a child abuser. And when he said that, I knew that either he was an idiot or I was an idiot, because in my mind that couldn't take place. But then I began to realize a lot of people began to believe this, that child abuse was so rife that every man was a potential child abuser. That really did shake me up, because if people had such a debased view of humanity on the left, then what was their politics like? And then the last thing that happened to me, which had a big impact, was the miners' strike, where we supported the miners' strike totally, but we argued that if there was going to be a strike, there had to be a ballot. I don't know if you remember the big debate about it. The miners in Nottingham, for example, said that we're not going to go on strike unless we have a ballot. And the argument was that there's no time for a ballot, and there's no point in doing that. And I felt that from a basic democratic point of view, if you are going to have a serious action like that, you do need to, have democratic forms of decision making. And I think that was the final thing that kind of pushed me in a different direction. So my politics, I would say, is a mixture of three different things. When it comes to family values, when it comes to personal relationships, when it comes to things like community, loyalties, things of that sort, I think I'm fairly conservative. I would see myself as a conservative with a small c. I think those are particularly important now when they are so much, there's so much being isolated and ghettoized. And I think it's quite important to stand up for those sensibilities. When it comes to free speech, freedom, any kind of form of free expression, I would say I'm libertarian, totally liberal. I think that anybody should be able to express whatever they want, as long as they're prepared to live with the consequences. So I'm totally, committed to a kind of a certain sense of freedom. And when it comes to economics, I change my mind on a regular basis between understanding the importance of the free market, whilst at the same time recognizing that it's very important that people have a safety net. That in a civilized society we do provide people with benefits such as education and health. The thing that I'm really against in the world, I'm not against welfare as such. What I am against is the way that welfare is used to make people dependent on welfare, and the way in which welfare has become a medium of political control rather than using it selectively for the right people. So it's a mixture of three different things that often seem to conflict, but in my mind they correspond to my experiences. So that's how I would describe myself.
So it was nothing, for example, to do with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, nothing like that?
I always knew they would fall. In fact, that was one of the arguments. Because I'm Hungarian, I never had the slightest positive association with Soviet Union or China or East Europe. And I could tell that it would fall. And people would argue with me saying that you're crazy. How could this formidable Soviet Union and this formidable Eastern Bloc just fall? I said, look, talk to people in Poland, Hungary, Russia.
Yes.
You'll find that nobody believes in the system at all. So that had nothing to do with it. It had to do with things within Britain itself, and in particular with our experiences. And the good thing was that everybody I was involved with in politics on the left, in the RCP, more or less drew a similar conclusion. We had a lot of arguments and discussions about it.
This would have been in the 90s, maybe this happened?
Yeah, 90s. And we basically said it'd be far better that we all, end our party life and go off as individuals and learn from our experiences and make our own way. And and that's what we did, and which I think worked quite well, because it meant that people had to live with the consequences of their action. They had to take responsibility for what they were doing, and they were able to use their old experience in a positive way. So I'm very proud of what I did in the 70s, because they gave me a vantage point from which to see both the right and the left.
You're actually writing a book, or in fact you've written a book, haven't you? One's coming out in a few months' time, which is about borders, isn't it? The need for borders. Now that would seem to be entirely opposite to an RCP position, which would have been borderless internationalism, wouldn't it?
So basically we live in a world where every single boundary that gave meaning to life is being called into question, not just national borders. So if you look around, people are saying that the boundary between man and woman is unnatural. I mean, who invented this? There are millions of genders. There's no point in simply sticking with the old school idea that there are men and women, only two sexes. That boundary's got to go. The boundary between adults and children is being increasingly called into question. And you have a situation where people no longer know when a child becomes an adult. It's no longer 18, is it 24, 30, 31? Total lack of clarity about it. The boundary between animals and human beings, which was fairly clear in the past. There's a lot of books being written about the fact that that's quite artificial. And there's no reason why we might not change our minds about this boundary. Very importantly, the boundary between the private and the public sphere, something I feel very strongly about, is being eroded, and people say we don't like the private sphere. It's a place where you have domestic abuse. We talk about the dark side of the family. So all in all, what happens is that this important boundary between the private and the public is being called into question. So in the book, what I try to do is to explain why this is happening and why we need to resist it, why culturally it's important that we deal with this problem.
You could say this is all about the infantilization of society, isn't it, really? I mean, just simply trying to turn things on the head just almost for the sake of it. I mean, surely saying animals, humans, there's no difference, whatever.
I think it's that, but it's also more profound. I think we've kind of lost the meaning of life. And we are very scared of dealing with the language of meaning. It's seen as being too moral. And it's also interesting that the very word moral now has got negative connotations. So when somebody talks about virtues or talks about good and evil, they're described as being moralistic. And morality itself is often seen as something people hide behind, as a way of obscuring their real intent. So when morality itself has got this very negative, minimalist connotations, then under those circumstances, people just lose their way and fall upon themselves and begin to react against everything that gave meaning to experience in the past. And to me, this is something, again, that transcends left and right.
Yes.
Because it was a conservative government, for example, in Britain, that institutionalized trans culture. I mean, they very casually decided that to insist upon the fact that there are only men and only women is somehow cultural sin. These are conservatives. These weren't, radical feminists or radicals of any sort. So you can see that all sections of the political spectrum, to some extent, have lost their own moral clarity, and their own moral sensibility is conspicuous by its weakness. And you can count on your hand the number of intellectuals or number of public figures who are able to speak convincingly in a language of moral norms.
We've just had a good example of that, I think, in the two judgments. You probably know. We had one where it was judged that a woman could not say at work that there is such a thing as two sexes, a man and a woman. That was absolutist. This is what the judge said, absolutist. So she was fired, and so she lost that. But at the same time, we've got the legal system saying that veganism should be treated in the same way as a belief system, a religion. This is serious moral confusion and chaos, isn't it?
It is, and I think it speaks to the fact that these moral confusions that you describe are legitimated by a judicial system where the members of the judiciary themselves have more or less been educated into the values that open the gates to anything that challenges tradition. In English language, we talk about judicial independence, and I'm a big fan of judicial independence. But what we often forget is, who are the people who are, working in the courts, and these are people that went to they're legal scholars, they're lawyers, who've been educated in different universities. And the ideas that they picked up in the universities invariably, without exception, inspired them and drive them towards conclusions, which in a sense is consistent with the zeitgeist of our time. So it's not surprising, and I actually wrote an article predicting this, that in today's courts a judge would rule veganism to be a religion, having the same authority as Judaism or Christianity or Hinduism. Right? I mean, that kind of outlook is now what you would expect from people. And it's not that they even think twice about it. They think that they are being, sort of extremely, considered in making these judgments. At the same time, the same judges, will slap somebody down who says that, I think that, biologically speaking, there are two sexes. We've been thinking that for thousands of years. Why can't I be allowed to say that in the 21st century? You get slapped down for that.
What is the book called, actually, the new book?
The new book is called why borders matter and why humanity has to relearn the art of drawing boundaries.
Right. Well, that's a
labor of love, yes.
Labor of love. Yeah. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. It's fascinating. Thank you very much, Frank. That's it for So What You're Saying Is this week. Do join us again next time. In the meantime, as a present to yourself in the new year, please do subscribe, won't you? Thank you very much. Bye.